Hello everyone, my name is Mike History, and welcome to my History of Christianity series. Now, before I get to the actual content of the video, it is important to explain a little bit what is going on here. So this video is part of a series on the history of Christianity, and it is a multi-episode series in which I go over Christian history in relative detail in order for you to better understand the history of the world's most dominant faith. However, there are a couple of things that you should know before you watch the video. All of the videos in these series were originally recorded as part of live streams that I did, which were based on a slideshow presentation that I made a couple of months ago. As such, it might include some instances of, for example, me using filler words or saying the word but nevertheless, I have tried my best to cut those parts out and make it sound as professional as possible. However, if you are wondering why it might sound a little off compared to my normal videos, that is why. Now, finally, a second thing to note is that all of the maps being used that show the spread of Christianity have been made by myself and are based on a base map from the computer game called Europa Universalis 4. As such, if you are wondering where the maps come from or who made them, those are mine. Otherwise, there isn't too much else to say. Enjoy the video, and I hope you learned something new. Let's go to the start of the church. Alright, so Christianity's apostolic age began after 120 believers, including all the apostles, received the Holy Spirit and began preaching the gospel in an event known as Pentecost. Now, within just a decade, the believers had begun to preach from Jerusalem all the way to Rome. And at Antioch, the believers were first given the name Christians. And an interesting thing about this is we don't know whether the word Christian was actually a compliment or a derogatory term, but regardless, that's what they are called now. The first ever church was set up in Jerusalem, and it was headed by James, the brother of Jesus. And this consisted only of Jewish believers. Now, what that meant is that Jewish laws were strictly adhered to. And so at this time, all Christians, because all Christians were Jews, all Christians were following these Jewish ceremonial laws. Let's move on to Paul the Apostle, who arguably, I guess one could say, is the most important Christian ever. So actually, one of the main opponents to these new religion of Christianity was Saul of Tarsus, who used to whoop believers, and by whooping believers I mean he used to go out and kill a bunch of them, until he bumped into Jesus on his way to kill more Christians, and he lost his sight for a while. He then renamed himself from Saul to Paul and began to be the first apostle to the Gentiles. And the Gentiles, for those of you who don't know, are just non-Jewish people. Now, he introduced Christianity specifically to the Greek world, going to Ephesus, Philippi, Corinth, and Thessalonica. And he was the foremost Christian thinker and author of the Apostolic Age, and placed a great emphasis on salvation by faith, and strongly objected to the idea that you had to follow the Jewish law to be saved. And trust me, this becomes a very important issue. So now we get to the first ever controversy in the Christian church, and trust me, this is the first of many, many controversies. Alright, so the circumcision controversy. This change in attitudes towards the Jewish law soon led to questions about whether these Gentiles were also under the Jewish law. And many converted Pharisees insisted that they had to be snipped to be saved. And for those of you who don't know what circumcision is, I'd say look that up in your own time. However, Paul believed that Jesus' death and resurrection ended the separation between Jews and Gentiles, who could now also be included in God's covenant, which had previously only been with the Jewish people. Now, this led Paul to visit the leaders of the Jerusalem church, which led to the Council of Jerusalem, the first ever church council around 50, which said and concluded that the Gentiles, and therefore Christians more generally, didn't have to follow Jewish law anymore. Now, unfortunately, the council did not totally solve the issue, since many of James's followers kept insisting that Jewish Christians had to follow the Old Testament laws. This caused Peter to actually break fellowship with Gentiles for a while, which caused him to be called out by Paul very publicly. After Herod Agrippa the king tried to kill him, James became the main leader of the church. However, in 62, James, the brother of Jesus, was killed on the order of the high priest, and this was the first sign of the upcoming wave of persecution. Now we get to the end of Jewish Christianity. Now, the first great persecution of Christians really began after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 was blamed on Christians by Emperor Nero, who in a very famous story is said to have been playing music while watching the city burn. Whether that happened or not, we don't know, but also he was kind of a cruel, psychopathic guy, so it wouldn't even be that surprising. And he totally did take advantage of the fire to create a massive palace, which I've been to, by the way, for himself in the burnt out areas. Now, some notable martyrs from this time are, well, Peter and Paul. Now, the first Jewish-Roman war broke out in 66, which resulted in the siege of Jerusalem in 70 and the destruction of the Jewish temple. This, alongside the deaths of Peter and Paul, marked the end of the period of Jewish Christianity. And again, I really want to emphasize here how important it was that the temple was destroyed, because for the Jews, the temple was the place where, well, it was this literal center of their religion. It was where they performed sacrifices. They had already had their temple destroyed once, rebuilt it, and then it was destroyed for good at this point. Now, as Jews began scattering from Jerusalem across the empire, Antioch switched from Jerusalem to become the main center of Christianity, and Christianity at this time became mainly a Gentile religion. And now we get to the end of the Apostolic Age. During the end of the reign of Emperor Domitian, who reigned from 89 to 96, a smaller persecution of Christians occurred, resulting in the exile of John the Apostle to Patmos in Greece, where he took some acid and wrote the Book of Revelation. Those of you who've read the Book of Revelation will get what I'm saying. No, he did not actually take acid, for those of you who are worried about that. As the century ended, it had become increasingly apparent even to the Romans that Christianity was indeed a separate religion from Judaism, and in 98, Emperor Nerva declared that Christians no longer had to pay the yearly tax for Jews, in effect recognizing officially that Christianity was indeed a different religion. Now, by the end of the first century, the New Testament had been written, the apostles were dead, and Christianity was now commonly recognized as a distinct religion. It was time to move forward. So let's look at the growth of Christianity in the first century. By 100, there were around 7,000 Christians, or 0.01% of the Roman population. During the first and second century, though, Christians were growing by 40% a decade. Christianity grew at this quick pace since there were no fees and baptism was free. It was also attractive to women since they were allowed greater freedom than in Roman paganism, and therefore women made up a significant portion of the church. And here is a map of the Christian majority areas. So for those of you who are wondering a little bit about the maps that I will be using, essentially this base map comes from the game EU4. I chose it because it's a pretty nice base map to use, has relatively good sized provinces, and is just something convenient. But we can see that, of course, right, Christianity was not a majority religion in a lot of the world, but it was already taking hold. By this time, Alexandria, Antioch, some of northern Israel, and even this small island here, Socotra, were all already majority Christian, well, by the year 100. So we can see that Christianity is starting off fairly well. Clement of Rome was the first apostolic father, serving as a bishop of Rome from 92 to 100, and his first epistle is the oldest Christian epistle outside of the New Testament. Another major apostolic father was Polycarp, who was the bishop of Smyrna, who tried but failed to persuade Pope Anicetus to have Western Christians celebrate Easter on the same day as in the East. And trust me, this Easter thing will become more important. Now, the word Christianity itself was first coined by Ignatius of Antioch, the bishop of Antioch from 68 to 107. And on his way to martyrdom, he wrote a series of letters where he identified the church hierarchy being of bishops, presbyters, and deacons. So again, for those of you who don't know, essentially deacons are kind of the guys who assist in the church. The presbyters are either known as the pastors or the priests today, so they are the main ones running the church, and then the bishops were there to be overseers. Ignatius also first coined the word Catholic, and can be considered in some way the first Catholic, as he was also the first to refer to the Bishop of Rome as the main leader of church and the vicar of Christ. For those of you who don't know, by the way, Catholic means universal. So as Christianity spread across the Roman Empire, it began being corrupted by local beliefs. Christians in Asia Minor emphasized union with Jesus as the way to reach eternal life. Christians in Rome were influenced by Stoicism and emphasized ethics and morality,
which led to an emphasis on penitence. Christians in Alexandria, meanwhile, were influenced by Platonism and were focused on ethics and allegorical emphasis on the Old Testament. Around the end of the 1st century, the first heresy emerged in Christianity known as Gnosticism. One of the most successful early Gnostics was the priest Valentinus, who served in the second half of the 2nd century. He believed that the material world was a prison created by the demiurge, an evil spirit who created the world. And this evil demiurge was the Old Testament God, which is an interesting take, to say the least. Now, secret knowledge would allow people to liberate their souls and allow them to return to the true God. For them, Jesus was the liberator of humanity against his father, apparently just being a typical rebellious teenager. Now, when the Jews rebelled again in 132, the Christians refused to join them, since their leader Simon Bar Kokhba claimed to be a Messiah. And as any good Messiah does, he actually just lost. Now, once his rebellion was crushed in 135, this marked the final split between Jews and Christians, including Jewish Christians. This was because Emperor Hadrian banned Jews from Jerusalem, and so all the bishops of Jerusalem after that were Gentiles. In 140, Marcion of Sinope, was the first person to propose a Christian canon. What that means is the first person to basically propose the idea of a Christian Bible. And after him, Christian texts began being divided into heretical and canonical categories. 4 years later, he was kicked out of the Church of Rome, and he developed a theology claiming that there was a difference between the evil Old Testament God and the good New Testament God. A very original idea, not one that we just looked at. He believed that Jesus' main mission was to overthrow the evil Old Testament God. Never mind that Jesus never said any of that. And he also wrote his own Gospel of Marcion, because I guess he needed to up those book skills. It looks like there were hustlers back in the day as well. Now we get to the Great Church. What is the Great Church? Well, good question. The Great Church was a period starting in 180 between the broader apostolic age and the legalization of Christianity, and saw many major changes that would define the future of the religion. Some of the great changes already seen before the start of the Great Church started around 150, such as the development of Mariology, and that includes the perpetual virginity of Mary, intercession of the saints, and relics. So this is what Christianity looked like by 180. Again, not crazy growth, but we can see that it is now spreading, ironically enough, actually in former ISIS territory, and then also spreading a little bit in Anatolia, and by this time also the Jerusalem area was majority Christian as well. So Irenaeus, he was the bishop of Lugdunum up until his death in 202, and his writings were very influential in the development of the theology of the Great Church. He was the first to refer to Mary as the co-redemptrix, first to explicitly refer to the Bishop of Rome as the leader of the entire church, and the first to refer to sacred tradition as a definitive source of authority in the church. He also was the first to use the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit formula, and wrote a famous piece of theology called Against Heresies around 180. It was during his time that several practices emerged, such as infant baptism, the idea of apostolic succession, and the establishment of a monarchical bishop. And what that means is that essentially the bishop had total control over the Christians in one city. Clement of Alexandria headed the School of Alexandria, and he created Christian Platonism by combining Greek philosophy with Christian theology, because apparently the book of Plato didn't make the cut for the Bible. The School of Alexandria was revived by his pupil Origen, with an E, not with an I, who produced a corrected Old Testament in Greek and wrote commentaries on every book of the Bible, which is pretty impressive. I mean, just reading the whole thing took me a year, and that's when I tried my hardest. I mean, it took me like 2.5 years other times. He used Greek philosophy to interpret the Bible allegorically. He believed that all creatures, including demons, would be reunited with God. He did not see God as Yahweh, but as the first principle, even though he had thoroughly studied the entire Bible, and so he should have come to a different conclusion. So, an unofficial movement to ostracize Christians from public spaces in Lugdunum, which is modern-day Lyon, France, led to persecution in 177. Christians were imprisoned, tortured, and fed to beasts. Persecution resumed during the reign of Septimius Severus from 193 to 211, although it remains unclear how much he was personally involved in it. An emperor who was more involved in persecutions was Maximinus Thrax, which I always thought was a very interesting, if not cool, name. Now, Christians who refused to honor the fake Roman pagan gods were punished, with Roman citizens beheaded or exiled, while non-citizens and slaves were put to death by wild beasts to entertain people. Because who doesn't want to watch beheadings for an afternoon out with your buddies? Now we get to the question of whether Jesus is human or divine. It is definitely a question that many have asked in the past and continue to ask in the present, but it was not always 100% settled in the early church. There were several beliefs, in fact, that were later deemed heretical. The Ebionites, an early group of Jewish Christians, believed in adoptionism, which stated that Jesus was born as a human and then was found in an orphanage and adopted by God. Okay, not the orphanage part, but they do believe he was adopted by God when he was baptized. Now, this was declared a heresy by Pope Victor I, who served as the Bishop of Rome from 189 to 199. Around this time, another heresy known as Docetism emerged, which stated that Jesus' body and crucifixion were illusions, and due to this, he couldn't have really died. The Docetists would have a lot in common with the Muslims, it looks like. Who's this guy? Tertullian. He was an author from Carthage who was the first great writer in Latin Christianity, and is sometimes referred to as the father of the Latin Church. He was the person who introduced many important terms. Ever heard of Trinity? That's him. Old Testament and New Testament? That's him. He was also the first Latin author to write of Christianity as the true religion and considered paganism as superstition. Spot on. He fiercely denounced many heresies, but then later joined the Montanists, who were considered heretical by most Christians, so I guess he failed in his mission. Another important Carthaginian Latin father was Cyprian, who served as the city's bishop from 249 to 258. Now we get to the first great persecution. So as I explained before, right, of course there have been persecutions, but this is the first big one. The first empire-wide and official persecution of Christians was known as the Decian persecution, named after Emperor Decius, who reigned from 249 to 251, so only actually 2 years. It began with an edict he issued in 250, which required all people except Jews to perform a sacrifice to Roman gods and obtain a signed witness certificate. Due to this pressure, over 3,000 Christians were martyred, but many apostatized out of fear. Most of these repented and were let back into the church, but some churches, especially in newly Christianized Africa, and by the way, when we say Africa here, we mean Tunisia, because that was the name of the Roman province there, refused to let them back in. Now we get to Valerian's persecution. That's Valerian. Not cool. Glad we broke his nose. Now, not long after Decius' death in 253, Emperor Valerian took the throne. 4 years later, he ordered all Christian clergy to sacrifice to the Roman gods and banned Christians from meeting in ceremonies. He later ordered all bishops to be executed, and all Christian noblemen would lose their titles and property. If they refused to sacrifice, they would also be martyred. One prominent martyr was none other than Bishop Cyprian of Carthage. Valerian's luck wouldn't last forever, because God got the last laugh and he would be captured by the Persians in 260. Sucks to suck. Even worse for his luck, his son Gallienus ended the persecution. This started what's known as the Little Peace of the Church, because this was a time during which Christianity became more integrated into the Roman culture. This really became apparent when Christians asked Emperor Aurelian, who again is not a Christian, to depose the adoptionist bishop of Antioch, Paul of Samosata, in 272, which is a bit funny because if you know anything about Aurelian, I think he had bigger fish to fry, as in reuniting the empire and avoiding assassination. Now, by 280, the area around Rome itself had actually become majority Christian, and Christianity started growing roots in the western part of the Roman Empire. So this is what the church looked like during the Little Peace of the Church. So we can see by now, right, the entire eastern Mediterranean coast had become Christian. We see that the province of Africa, which again is this region, had become Christian. Alexandria, of course, even spreading to different parts of Arabia. And then even a little bit in Switzerland, of all places. So you can see very much, obviously, it's still an Eastern religion, again, mostly concentrated in the Middle East and Greece. But Christianity is starting to spread west. By 300, Christians made up a tenth of the Roman population. So not bad. But Rome would not actually be the first ever Christian state. That honor instead would go to Armenia. King Tiridates III had ordered the persecution of Christians, but one Christian named Gregory refused to sacrifice to their false pagan gods. He was persecuted, but at some later point healed the king and was released. After this, Tiridates and his court converted to Christianity in 301, and then Gregory went around the country destroying pagan temples like a total epic savage. He was then consecrated as Bishop of Armenia and erected several churches. And so this is what Christianity now looked like in 301. So we can see just in that short time, in the last 30-ish years, it has spread a lot. So we see Armenia here now has become Christian. Pretty much all of the Levant, Syria, large parts of Mesopotamia, large parts of Arabia, more of Africa. Rome itself at this point had become majority Christian. Different parts of Gaul, northern Italy as well. So Christianity spread a good amount. Now, despite this good news in Armenia, the Christians in the Roman Empire were about to face the greatest challenge ever. Diocletian became emperor in 285 and purged the army of Christians, surrounding himself with anti-Christians. He wanted to restore Rome to its former glory and saw Christianity as an obstacle to that goal. Diocletian decided to reorganize the Roman Empire and came up with the tetrarchy system, which would have the empire split in two, with one emperor in the east and another in the west, known as Augustus, and then their deputy emperors would become known as Caesar. So yeah, Julius Caesar would be thrilled about hearing that. In 302, Diocletian's Caesar Galerius urged him to begin a general persecution of Christians. This persecution officially began on the 23rd of February 303, and all Christians were required to sacrifice to the Roman gods. Where have we seen this story before? But the persecution was not as fierce across the empire, but was more vigorously pursued in the east by Diocletian and Galerius, where there also were more Christians, and less so in the west by Maximian and his Augustus, Constantius Chlorus. Now, Constantius was actually the lazy guy in the whole persecution group project, and barely even tried to persecute. His son Constantine ended the persecution in Britain and Gaul when he took over in 306. Now, in 305, Anthony the Great decided to take a break from being persecuted and chose to chill out in the Egyptian desert, which I think sounds a lot more fun than being mauled alive by lions in the Colosseum. A lot of people thought, hey, this guy's got a good idea, and Anthony decided to become a hermit with them, therefore becoming the first monk, because essentially the difference between a monk and a hermit is hermits are by themselves and monks are not. These monks were chose to be poor and gave up all their possessions, even their Xboxes. There were two types of monasticism. There was eremitical and cenobitic. Now, I know these sound like just nerdy terms, like eremitical and cenobitic. So we're going to explain a little bit. So eremitical monasticism was characterized by villages of hermits who mostly spent time alone. In other words, the introvert monks. And then cenobitic monasticism was characterized by community life, and it was basically the path for extroverts or people with friends. That doesn't include me, by the way. Anyways, we will not go on about that. We get to the end of the Diocletianic persecution. Western Augustus, Maximian's successor Severus II, was overthrown by Maxentius in 306, who promised religious toleration. Despite having instigated the persecution, in 311 Galerius weirdly passed the Edict of Serdica, which ended the persecution in the east. But his successor Maximinus was like, no bro, and he resumed the persecution. In 312, Constantine and then Maxentius went to war to determine who would rule the Western Roman Empire. Constantine gathered 40,000 soldiers and reached the edge of Rome on the 27th of October. Now we get to the battle that changed the faith, and I would actually argue the most important battle in human history. Now that evening, Constantine had a vision in which he saw a cross of light above the sun with the words, "By this sign you shall conquer." He then had his soldiers paint a chi rho, or the first two letters of Christ in Greek, on their shields. The next day, his soldiers fought Maxentius on the Milvian Bridge, during which Maxentius drowned, allowing Constantine to enter Rome. Maxentius's body was found, and his head was chopped off and paraded around town. By the way, this was like normal back then, allowing Constantine to become the uncontested Western Roman Emperor. In 313, Constantine and co-emperor Licinius passed the Edict of Milan, which ended the Diocletianic persecution and legalized Christianity. Now, 312 is probably the most important year in Christian history, since it marked Christianity's transition from an underground movement to a powerful and flourishing religion. Constantine soon began getting involved in church affairs. In 316, he acted as a judge in a dispute concerning Donatism. Donatists believed that only holy Christians who had not apostatized could administer sacraments. Constantine tried to solve the dispute and ruled against the Donatists, but they just said nah, and the split continued.